Are you? Valentina.
Hello. Hi, Valentino. Welcome. All right, we'll get started in just a few seconds. All right. Hello, everyone. I know folks are still joining in, so welcome. Welcome to the American Pharmacists Association Foundation's Women in Pharmacy annual fall event. And our topic today is giving and receiving feedback. And we have a wonderful moderator and panelists to help take us through that journey. My name is Farah Tofik, and I'm chair of the Women in Pharmacy Advisory Committee. We're really excited to have so many of you join us today from so many different practice areas. And I see several students have also tuned in, and we have some watch parties that are going. So a shout out to all of you. We're really excited to have you as a part of this event. So thank you so much for being here. The APHA Foundation is dedicated to ensuring that the outstanding achievements of women in our profession are recognized and celebrated. Through activities that are planned by the Women in Pharmacy Committee, we work to provide resources related to leadership development, networking, balancing the demands of a career and personal life. Our umbrella for Women in Pharmacy is inclusive of all pharmacists, student pharmacists, and pharmacy technicians. However, our events are not exclusive to women. We invite anyone in the pharmacy profession to attend, as collaboration and support from all of our colleagues is important. Thank you to this year's Women in Pharmacy sponsor, Merck, and for your continued support of the APHA Foundation and to joining these special events. I would now like to introduce our moderator for tonight, Kelsea Zukauckas. Kelsea is a solid organ transplant pharmacist at the University of Utah Health, practicing in inpatient and outpatient setting with heart, kidney, liver, and lung transplant patients. Kelsea is passionate about always learning more about different feedback techniques and excited to moderate the webinar today. Over to you, Kelsea. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Farah. Good evening, everyone. We have a couple of items to go over before we get started. So first, please remember to keep your microphones muted throughout the panel session. Tonight's questions are formulated on a multitude of questions we received from registrants during that registration. You may use the chat to ask additional questions that will be answered following the panel. If you see a question in the chat that you also have, give it a like so we can prioritize those questions. During the Q&A, you are welcome to raise your hand, and once called on, unmute your line to ask your question. I'd now like to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is going to be Dr. Omolola Adeoye-Olatunde, is the Dar Cheney Assistant Professor at Purdue University College of Pharmacy, founder and principal investigator of her lab, and Director of Community Engagement and Evaluation for the Center of Health Excellence, Quality, and Innovation. She looks forward to sharing real-life experiences on giving and receiving feedback across her diverse roles and teams throughout her community practice and research-focused career. We also have Dr. Lauren Bristow, is the Senior Director of Pharmacy at Providence South Puget Sound. She oversees 2 hospitals and a large ambulatory care pharmacy team providing primary care, disease state management, and oncology infusion services. She is currently the chair of the APHA Health System Pharmacy Community and served as an inaugural member of the Health System Strategy Council years ago. Her passion to serve as a catalyst for positive change in every relationship and circumstance and position. And lastly, we have Dr. Steph Luon. She is a manager of ambulatory clinical pharmacy services at Yale New Haven Health, where she spearheads innovative clinical initiatives to enhance patient-centered, high-value care. With a strong focus on expanding access to healthcare, Dr. Luon develops and optimizes clinical programs that elevate the standards of care delivery. Previously, she served as the residency program director for the PGY2 ambulatory care pharmacy residency at Yale, where she nurtured a culture of continuous improvement through her passion for giving and receiving meaningful feedback. Dr. Luon is currently enrolled in the MBA for Executives program at the Yale School of Management, where she serves as class advisor for the healthcare cohort. We have an outstanding group of panelists tonight, and I can't wait to hear everybody's takes on giving and receiving feedback. So with that, we'll jump into our first question. So I want to ask each of our panelists tonight, why is giving and receiving feedback important?
I can take a first stab at that. So thank you all for having me. I'm excited to be here with my co-panelists. I had an answer, but then I asked my son, who is 3 years old. So I asked it in a way that made sense for him. And when I asked him why it's important, he said, because conversation, mommy. You have to talk about it. And I said, that's right. And so I'm going to start with that. It's important to have give and receive feedback because conversation is important. You have to talk. Yeah.
I can add to that. So, really, to me, feedback enables us to continually improve and grow. It improves our self awareness and the ability to strengthen our emotional intelligence to better understand how we're being perceived. Feedback strengthens our relationships, it improves our accountability, and really helps us improve engagement within our teams. Feedback is also essential for innovation to occur, as we need to know what is working well, what we could be doing better, or how we could potentially change a process to deliver high quality patient care. People need to be comfortable giving and receiving feedback so that we can continue to advance pharmacy practice and improve patient care.
Absolutely. I agree with both of those prior answers. I think the only a couple perspectives I might add is one, my favorite value, one of my favorite values is excellence. And to Stephanie's point and Lola's point, you can't get better without feedback. You can't get better without knowing what your results are, what they need to be. And so for us in healthcare, we need to be better because our patients deserve better. Our patients deserve the best. And if you're a believer in continuous improvement, we're never there. So what is that? What is the feedback, the information we need to get to better? Our teammates deserve better. Our teammates deserve processes that make sense. And we deserve to be our best. We deserve to be satisfied and fulfilled by the work that we're doing. The last kind of perspective or paradigm I want to offer is we all learned scientific method when we were in school. We have a hypothesis, we test our hypothesis, we make observations, and then we have discussion and come to a conclusion. Well, feedback is that observation. Feedback is we remember this from different biological processes in the cell, right? There are feedback loops that tell our bodies what to do more of and what to do less of. Well, we need that same thing. And so we'll talk more about this as we keep getting into the different topics, but if we stay curious, like scientists, we decide what kind of outcome we want. We come up with the hypothesis on what we think will get us that outcome. In any circumstance, that feedback is our findings, if you will, in that experiment to help us know what new hypothesis we need to test next.
Thank you so much for your answers. I think all of those are super necessary to go throughout the process of receiving feedback and giving feedback. So being a new practitioner myself, I wanted to ask you, Lola, what advice do you have for new practitioners or new leaders on ensuring that your feedback, especially in a situation where it might not be the most positive, is perceived as constructive rather than critical?
Yeah, great question. And I just want to start off with like my views of leadership or a anything new practitioner. We're all either there or have been there and will continue to be in new positions. So students online, you all are leaders in your own way, whether it's in an organization formally or being a leader. Maybe you're the first, person in your family to go to pharmacy school. Who knows? You are a leader in every way. And no matter what position you're at, whether you're new or old, giving feedback is real, y'all. Like, I just want to come with the realness here. And I don't care how long you've been doing it. It can feel new with each person that you're interacting with. And I will probably give my advice based off of what some may call failures, or maybe I felt was a failure at that time, but it has given me so much perspective for where I'm at now in my leadership. For me, I think number one, do not wait to start giving feedback. Don't let that be the first time you're giving feedback or the first time you're having conversations outside of this is the task we need to get done, let's get it done. You have to build a foundation with people that you're trying to be in relation with. You're trying to, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's my husband or my children, you have to first build that foundation so that we're all aware of what's the best way to provide feedback to this person. You got to understand what motivates them. Why are they here? Why are we here? And if we could start with knowing like our shared purpose and goals, that helps us make sure that when we're going into these conversations around number one, why am I giving this feedback? You need to ask yourself that. Also, the person receiving the feedback should be asking, what am I to do with this feedback? And if they're not clear, if neither party is clear, that is usually when it's the most difficult, because then we lean into making it about us sometimes, and we forget the goal that we even had when we went into the conversation or why we even came here in the first place. So I would say definitely don't let your first interaction with this person be about giving bad feedback. That should not do that. And I have done that before. Maybe it's because of timing and circumstances. I started in my role pregnant, very pregnant. And so like the team that I was introduced to, we had very little time to get to know each other. And the one mandatory thing I had to do while on maternity leave was feedback, like through the processes that are in place that you have to give your employees and staff feedback. And I realized that should not have been the first time that we sat down to talk about just getting to know each other, what motivates us. And so the next time around, we made sure that before we have to do this mandatory thing. So I guess that's point two, don't let the mandatory thing be the thing that drives you to give feedback either. And so we sat down and we came up with shared goals, and decided like what would need to happen to meet those goals so that we're both clear on what that looks like. And goals can look like goals for your work environment, but personal ones too, because that feeds in how we go about addressing our goals, right? And each person is different and needs different things, and you will not get it right every time. Just know that. I don't care if you're new or old or whatever you want to call it, as far as practitioner or your stage in your career and leadership, like you will not get it right every time. But if you all can come back to your shared purpose and goals and take a step back, I think it makes it easier or less feeling like it's a personal attack and more about let's make this about our shared goals and what we want to do to achieve that excellence together.
Thank you so much. I think you hit it right on the nose. It's just always trying to have those crucial conversations and opening that door rather than staying silent. And so as I go throughout my career, I get a little bit nervous when trying to potentially give feedback to a superior. So Lauren, I wanted to ask you, when you're trying to give feedback to a supervisor, for example, who you might have more qualifications or experience than they necessarily do, how do you broach and approach that situation?
Yeah, so at the risk of some redundancy, I'm going to say a lot of the things that Lola already said, because that's all part of it. One, I just want to dispel any kind of myth that you may believe consciously or subconsciously that if you follow these 5 steps, it's never going to go sideways and you're never going to feel awkward. It's never the case. It's never the case. This is one of those things you got to have a bunch of bad reps and you got to get reps in before it's easier. But if you're taking it with the weight that you should, especially when we're talking about potentially critical feedback, especially if it comes to a superior or someone in a position of power over you, or someone that you're very close to, that the relationship very much matters, it still needs to be gone into with clarity. It's one of the things that Lola spoke about. The other point that I put is the more relationship you have as a background and a foundation for having these conversations, the more we call it on my team, we've just come up with this in the last like 6 months with my leaders, relational elasticity. So like it can stretch, it can grow. I think of it as like grace. We used to talk about grace being the synovial fluid in the joints that like helps us move like a body. Like it's hard. Work is hard. Feedback is hard. Getting better is hard. And so sometimes these conversations are hard. So if you have time to build the relationship, do that first with genuine interest. And empathy is the other thing, like just as simple as like taking 5 seconds and put yourself in their position. If someone comes to you and says X, how are you going to feel about that? What would set you up for success? So just 5 seconds, think about it from the other person's perspective. It's going to go a long way. The other couple things, and we've talked about crucial conversations, that is a Bible when it comes to entering some of these. There's very specific tools you can use inside there, but a couple things you want to go back to. And anytime there's a tense conversation, feedback or otherwise, intent, go back to your intent, and your intent needs to be good. Your intent needs to be pure, and it needs to be mutually beneficial. Okay. So that's where you got to check yourself. If your intent is entitlement and you're inconvenienced, stop, pause, do not bring that to your leader or your one up or your preceptor or whatever. Like pause, take a second, think about what is going to appeal to them for mutual benefit for both of them. And then the last thing, we talked about it a little bit before, is stay curious, keep asking questions. Ask them questions first. Maybe don't assume you know why X is Y. Maybe start with, hey, I noticed so-and-so. Can you tell me more about that? Maybe that's how you do it. Or I've worked in a lot of positions, and I've worked with some colleagues here on this call where all of us on the team had different skill sets and different areas of strength. And so there's many times I'm working with the leader, either a peer leader or a higher leader or one of my leaders, that they have a skill set I don't, or I have a skill set they don't. So what I might do is ask a question that highlights something I see that they may not see, in a way that, hey, I thought about this. Would that be beneficial in this situation? Can I help develop that? Or is that something we have time to do? So again, depends on what is your intended outcome. What are you hoping to find, hoping to come out of this? Why? Why do you want this? And then why do they also want this? And if you start with that, then, and again, it's kind of like running, if you've worked in an inpatient and you've had to run a code, you're terrified of it until you've done it a few times. And then you know you'll get through it. You'll know, getting on a flight with a small child, you know you'll make the plane will eventually land. It may be awful in the middle of time, but you know you'll get to the other side of that. So you can do it and go into it a little more bravely that next time.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I really enjoyed your analogy of relational elasticity. I've never heard that before, and I think that's really an amazing analogy to be able to discuss and ensure everybody is going towards the same intent. Shifting gears a little bit, Steph, can you share a time when you potentially received some difficult feedback that you necessarily didn't agree with, and how you approached and managed that situation?
Phew, tough question, but sure. So I'll talk about an example from my current schooling, because I know a lot of you are students. So I was at the beginning of my MBA program completing an intensive 2-week immersion, and my learning team had several group assignments due in quick succession. So after a particularly tiring day of class, we started to review our microeconomics homework assignment. And this is not the microeconomics of pharmacy school. This is the microeconomics with like finance and econ majors. So a little bit of a challenge for me, to say the least. And so we started to work on that homework assignment together in a collaboration breakout room. And I quickly realized that I needed more caffeine if I was going to have any productive contribution to those conversations. So I let my team know that I needed to grab some coffee and asked if anyone wanted anything, and left for a few minutes. I later received some anonymous feedback. We were doing feedback sessions in class, that I had to step out of the room during a stressful situation because I couldn't handle the pressure. At first, when I received that feedback, I was shocked. I thought, wow, that person completely misunderstood what happened. I clearly just needed to caffeinate to push through to help the team. But upon reflection, I really realized that regardless of how I felt, the feedback that he shared was how I was being perceived. And as a leader with some lofty career aspirations, I certainly don't want to be perceived as someone who can't handle high stress situations. So I quickly changed my mindset from being resistant to the feedback to one of really deep gratitude that someone was willing to share that feedback with me, that they actually cared enough to do that. And so now I can work diligently to make sure that others aren't perceiving me that way in the future. I think that that's been something that I've kind of struggled with as I've grown up in my pharmacy career is if you receive feedback, learning just to say thank you, not to push back, and to just kind of self-reflect on, okay, this is how I'm being perceived. How can I avoid this from happening in the future? And I think that's been a really valuable lesson for me.
Thank you so much, Steph. I totally agree that it's hard sometimes to switch from feeling resistant to that gratitude purpose and understanding that people are trying to just see you succeed and grow as you evolve in your practice. So I have had definitely situations, and I think all of us on the call being pharmacists or students going to be pharmacists, we're all kind of perfectionists, and it's quite difficult sometimes to likely receive feedback and it not always be positive. And so, Lauren, I wanted to ask you, how do you embrace constructive criticism while avoiding that feeling that the negative feedback means that you're not good enough, or to people on your team if they've experienced this?
Absolutely. So at the risk of preaching a little bit at y'all, I had this conversation recently with my set of residents, but one of the things you really need to come to terms with now and at different points in your career is how much of your self-worth you have attached to your work product or your identity at work or what you get done or what you don't get done, because that is not a safe place to have your self-worth attached. It's not. And if you want to know how bad it is, experience failure, get some negative feedback. And if it tanks your world, you need to detach, you need to pull back from that. And so, and I'm happy to talk about, different ways that you might want to do that if that's something you want to get into. And also I'll take this moment to just, you guys, we have time for more questions. So make sure you guys are putting those in the chat and putting thumbs up around ones that you would like us to focus on first. But I will say, when you're getting feedback, if you can switch away from having your self-worth in the mix, in the blender, when it comes to feedback about your job, if you can pull back, stay curious, almost as an outsider, like you're watching you as a scientist, that was not the outcome that I wanted. I wanted that person's perception of me to be different. So what do I need to do next time? What does my input need to be next time to get a different outcome? I'll take it up a couple notches. As a leader, if your staff if people are willing to give you feedback, the higher you go in title or an organization, the less feedback you're going to get, because the power distance makes it harder and harder. And then if you're somebody like me, where you already have kind of an intense personality, people are already borderline avoiding you anyway, because they don't know what your reaction is going to. I'm an intense person, and so I have to really work to get people that report to me or that people that report to them feedback. And if anybody ever risks on being honest with me about a time that something I did impacted them or affected them negatively, that is a nugget. And it's almost like a seed that I have to baby and I have to water. And so, to Steph's point, the moment you become defensive, they're done. They are no longer going to invest in you. You have closed that door. You think about the conversation we just had, well, how hard this is to enter into this space bravely. And you think about somebody shuts you down, are you ever going to risk it that again? You're not. So same for you, if you're trying to maintain any kind of relationship, meaningful relationship in your life, if someone gives you feedback or makes an observation that is negative and you shut them down, you're immediately creating a distance between you and them. So I'm going to go past, Dr. Luon encouraged us to say thank you. I'm going to push past that. I'm going to challenge you, especially if you're wanting leadership, to get curious, ask more questions, understand why they came to that conclusion. Because I'll tell you, even if their intent is bad, even if they are jealous or spiteful or whatever, there still may be value in that for you, right? And so I want to just encourage you to balance this with, you need a board of directors in your life who are for you, who love you enough and respect you enough to be honest with you. And so what you do is, that is your filter, that is your sifter. You take the feedback you get from this other person, you say, hey, this person said this, how does that ring true of what you know of me? And you have to have given them express permission to say the thing. And if nobody's saying the thing to you, then you got a little bit deeper to go in your relationships. I'll just say that. And at the end of the day, I've paid a lot of money in counseling and therapy, and I highly recommend it. But what I paid a lot of money for was the concept that it's at the end of the day, it's none of your business what other people think about you. But to Stephanie's point, it is powerful to know how other people perceive you. And that is something that empowers you to make a choice in how you know, the work that you do want to do around that. Because I want to say we don't ever have to care, but as a leader, you do have to care. If I'm viewed as ineffective or out there, I cannot be effective in advocating for things for resources for my team, because no one takes me seriously, right? So to some point it does matter, but again, who you are, what you're worth, what you contribute, what you mean in the world has to be detached from your work product or your work identity.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I think the piece of staying curious is really valuable, because as pharmacists, we stay curious in general about practice guidelines and what's always going on with practice of pharmacy, but maybe necessarily not thinking to stay curious within self and how you are perceived or how you portray yourself to others. So I really appreciate you discussing and diving into that. And then just to give us some tips overall, what are just some general best practices that you guys utilize for giving and receiving feedback during your career, your day-to-day life with anybody? And I would like all of you to answer this, or any of you, whoever wants to take this question.
I can get us started. I think a lot of the things that I was thinking about saying, Lauren has already highlighted very nicely. So I'll just kind of add to that. So when I'm providing feedback to learners or pharmacists or technicians that I'm managing, I always ask them to self-reflect first. For me, this is most helpful to gauge whether the person that I'm trying to provide constructive feedback to is already aware of what they need to improve upon. And if they have no idea, it's going to be a very different conversation if you need to loop them into the problem. So the repeated practice also really helps people learn to self-reflect and identify their strengths and opportunities for improvement on their own. And this is a crucial skill to help prepare people for interviews, because you're often going to get asked, what are your strengths? What are your opportunities for improvement? And with those opportunities for improvement, you should always be thinking about an action plan for how I'm already working to improve them. So when I need to provide constructive feedback about performance, I, similarly to what my colleagues have shared, really like to ask people to share their perspective. Tell me what happened. I'll share the objective information that I received, and then try to understand like what I'm missing. I always assume positive intent and never assume malicious intent. So I'll continue to kind of ask open-ended questions about what could they have done differently, what will they do in the future to mitigate this, until we've created an action plan together for how they can improve. This kind of coaches them to go through that process on their own in the future. And if someone's not able to self-reflect and recognize the issue, I use a framework called situation, behavior, and result. This way you can first kind of like objectively share the context of the situation, the behavior that the person demonstrated, and then what the result of that behavior was, to really be clear about the feedback that you're providing is about the behavior and not about the person. And I think that correlates well with what Lauren was saying about your self-worth. When you're providing someone with feedback, it's much better to criticize or talk about a concern with the behavior, not criticizing the person individually. So that's been really helpful for me.
Could you repeat the question one more time, Kelsey?
Of course, yes. Just any general best practices you like to utilize with giving and receiving feedback in your day-to-day practice.
Yes, very ironic that this is happening this week, I feel like, or just like recently. I have really been understanding what it means to have people ready to give and receive feedback, including myself, especially amongst diverse teams. And when I say diverse, I think I want it to be clear, like that means that we all come with different ways of thinking, how we approach, especially when a lot of us may be tying our identity to these behaviors, even if it's behaviors that we're criticizing. We tie it to who we are. And I've learned that we have to unpack that first. And I am the first person to run away from unpacking feelings. Like, it's just not something I naturally lean into, but I have come to a point where my team is so diverse, and like whether it's culturally or just how we were raised, and like we do a lot of work that it's around health equity and public health. So it's important work that we're all passionate about, and we have strong perspectives on how it should look and feel when we're doing that work. And I think it's been a lot of work on myself, work amongst my team, students, because I'm in academia. So students, staff members, of us understanding like, why are we feeling this type of way? And like starting there, because a lot of it sometimes is tied to us, like just because what a word you said triggered me, right? Because it's a word that triggered me as a child, but we don't make those connections in the moment. We're just reacting right now. We're reacting, and we don't, not a lot of us have had an opportunity to be reflective and self-aware. As a student, you're like, I'm trying to get this PharmD. Like, I don't got time to be worried about like who I am as a person. I just want to get this PharmD, right? That was me, at least. I don't know other students on the line, but a lot of it is like, if anything is getting in my way of just getting this degree, like I don't want to deal with it. But I will say, like, these are things you can start figuring out about yourself now. Like just asking yourself, like, why do I feel like I want to react to this? Because sometimes it is attacking that person. And you want to ask yourself, is there something else going on that I need to first unpack, and not necessarily the person? And if there is something else, for example, if you did feel disrespected, how do you now tell that person? And do you know why you feel disrespected? You can't just say, don't do that, because constructive feedback informs people why you're giving this feedback. And it also informs them how they could either do it differently that works well for you if it is something personal. Because I want to separate personal, because there are things personal that get in the way of us working together well. That students, we all know that you've been in team groups that you were forced to be in, and it's not necessarily like they're not doing, you just don't like how they do things, or you're not used to being around people like the other student you may be in relation with in team groups. So I think you have to understand yourself, your biases you may bring, your preferences. We all have preferences. Like it's so easy to work in groups that are all just like you. Like we think the same, we're all executors, like let's get it done. But then you have someone who's like, I'm a thoughtful person. I like to sit and think, and the executor's like, we don't have time for this. Like, let's go, let's go. And so even things like that, when I'm talking about diversity, like how our strengths, our approaches, the things we like, they're different. And I'm just learning that we got to unpack that for ourselves and the people we're working with. So those will be best practices for me.
Yeah, I love those. I would echo both of the ones that all of the areas that Lola and Steph both covered. The thing that I think I would add is, we talked a little bit about it, but again, really intention is big. And if you've done any training around crucial conversations, there's multiple times that you go back to stating intent when you don't know that person really well, when things start to go tense or start to go sideways. You're saying something and they went off on one of the other things that was on their mind today, or you hit a nerve you didn't think to. You got to have intent clear as day before walking into one of those conversations, and then you just keep going back to it. And again, the other part that I try to do is tie that immediate right now intent of why I'm talking to you about this thing, to the bigger vision that's already been cast, or the mutual direction we all know we're already going on. So we have to do this thing because we both want to finish this project well. That is why I'm having this conversation with you. If it's a I don't like your humor and you get on my nerves, like keep it to yourself. No one cares. Right. So, I mean, weigh it out in terms of what you're willing to talk about in that space. But I love the SBR tool we use, SBI, where I'm at, situation behavior impact. So when I do a lot of performance management and coaching with people that have never had performance, a lot of leaders don't do performance management. It's awkward. It's good enough. A lot of leaders won't go into that space. And so for me, I'm like, the goals here and what I'm about, how I lead, is we put our patients first and then we have our teams back. So when this happened in this situation and you did X or you said X, we say I as impacts. The impact to the rest of the team, did you see their face when you said that thing or when you had that outburst or refused to respond to them? Did that put our patients first or have our teams back? No. So if you have some established framework that you can keep referring back to, if that's your organization's mission or vision or values, like those are all things that need to be integrated and really need to be the basis and tied to your intent if possible, especially if you're in a leadership role, so that people have a framework and they already know where you're going to. It shouldn't be the first time they're hearing it, or it shouldn't be kind of out of left field, and it shouldn't sound like your personal preference to what Lola was speaking about. It needs to be tied to that bigger picture that we have mutual agreement around, whether it's explicit or understood.
Thank you for sharing. I agree with all of you that it's really important to keep in mind that we're looking at the behavior specifically, not the person. And then Lola, you really hit on something that I think is interesting that would be beneficial to discuss a little bit more. You were talking about just different personalities and how you handle feedback. And so with the generational differences and a lot of cultural differences and everybody having different ways that they like to communicate or learning styles, and with people that potentially are in a remote setting, how do you give feedback and ensure that you're having an adequate conversation with all these different diverse changes?
Yeah. That's a real question, right? And I think I touched on some of it as far as like self-awareness is key. Like as leaders, none of our programs are set up to help us go through self-awareness. Like when you're onboarded, they don't ask you as a leader, are you self-aware? What work have you done to do that, right? So we end up figuring it out along the way. It might have been after a blow up. Like it could have been so many things that led us to be forced to have to figure out like, where am I coming from? Why is this? Why am I approaching things like this? Or, we've been in teams that thought like us for the longest, and the first time we're in a leadership role, we now have people who think differently than us, that have different cultures than us. And the first thing may be to avoid, like that's usually a default for some people, is to avoid, not a good default. So like, I will say that was my default of like, let's not get into things that will require us to understand each other's preferences or cultures or personality. Let's make work. But it doesn't, when you're working with people, it can't just be work. Like you're working with people who carry out the work, right? What I have had to do is understand my strengths and knowing my blind spots and defaults. And I have been faced head on to know that, you know what, this is a place where this is not within me. I need to seek external help. I think that is key. And if anything, for those organizational leaders on this line, I think any organization should provide resources to leaders to get external guidance or external help, whether it's self-work through therapy and counseling for us individually, because we realize that, I'm not able to give effective feedback because I have self-work to do, right? Or if it's through, I want to have resources for our team to be able to figure out our self-awareness, right? And that's where I'm at right now. I'm seeking consultants on like, how do we go about building these diverse teams that we all say we want? And now we have it, and we're trying to navigate making sure everyone feels heard and seen, and it can contribute to our shared purpose in meaningful ways while bringing their full identity that is separate from the work, right? But that helps us do the work well together. And so that's where I'm at. Like, know your strengths and what you can do on your own, and also know when you need to seek outside help. outside help that can have a perspective that you may not be able to see when you're in it, right? And so I think that's part of it when you're working with diverse teams. Don't see, and I'm someone who works in health equity, y'all. Like I do diversity and like that's my role. Like that is what I do. And I am finding myself, even when I'm in that space, that I wasn't, when I said diverse team, I didn't realize like it was going to take this work, right? Like, and we didn't all, like it's going to take work because I do want people to show up authentically, which means if you show up your full self, not everyone is going to be used to that. And not everyone understands why you may say certain things a certain way. And certain cultures, for different genders, different like respect, what respect looks like. In Nigeria, I have Nigerian descent. My parents are Nigerian. My husband is Nigerian. I would identify as a Black Nigerian American. I was born in the United States. And even those conversations of understanding like, oh, respect looks like this for you, but for me, I think it's disrespectful when you say women, you're protecting women. Like for example, you think protecting a woman is good, but that to me can feel disrespectful because I want you to know that I'm a boss. And so those conversations need to be had so that we understand where each person is coming from, right? But we have to have that baseline that we're all in this together. At the end of the day, we have our shared goals. We are passionate about the same things. We just need to figure out each other's languages and how we can both all feel fulfilled. Fulfillment is so important to me that when you're in work, you should feel fulfilled in that role, whatever that role is. And we should have access to resources to allow us to do that. And sometimes you got to do the work to do that. And sometimes you can do it on your own. And sometimes it's okay to ask for external help.
Thank you so much. I totally agree that it's important to know that asking for help is not a weakness and that this is an ever evolving door. And so we're always going to be asking for help and asking for ways to grow and develop, and knowing what you're good at and knowing what you need to improve on is so important. And so one of the ways I think you can do that is ensuring that you get feedback from others. And so sometimes there are scenarios though where you're looking for feedback, nobody's giving feedback. So I wanted to ask Steph, how do you ask for feedback if you're not getting in certain situations? And how do you approach that to ensure that somebody's willing to give that to you?
Yeah, I think as Lauren mentioned, I definitely resonate with as you transition out of school and out of residency into higher and higher leadership roles, you get less and less feedback, and people are less willing to give you any constructive feedback. And so I love feedback. I think you've probably recognized that given that I'm here this evening. But I want feedback. I need feedback. I know that it's going to help me improve and grow. And so when I am needing feedback, I ask for it. So, for example, when I'm giving a presentation or leading an important meeting where I really want to receive feedback because maybe this is a new area for me, or I'm meeting with someone very high up and I have to explain an intricate concept in pharmacy, but make it understandable for someone who's outside of pharmacy, I'll ask someone before the meeting who's also going to be joining and ask if they'll be willing to provide me with constructive feedback. If I'm focusing on something particular, for example, like how I would explain that certain concept to a non-pharmacy person, I'll share that specific request with them. That way, they'll be prepared to really evaluate and listen critically, and provide me with feedback. Additionally, I often will phrase my feedback requests as like, what can I do to better support you as a manager? How could I have executed XYZ project better? I try to be really specific so that people, instead of just saying, what feedback do you have for me, or saying I want feedback or I need feedback, ask them specific questions so it can help jog their memory. So if you're on rotation and you feel like you're not getting the feedback that you're looking for, give your preceptor that feedback and say like, hey, I'm someone who really values constructive feedback. I want to learn and grow as much as I can. I know I have this presentation coming up, or we have rounds together coming up. I'd really appreciate it if you could give me feedback on how I could improve. And the preceptor might have you self-evaluate that feedback and how you're doing, and maybe give you feedback of like they agree with how you're self-reflecting, or give you ideas for how you can improve. But you have to kind of take ownership of requesting that feedback and holding people accountable to giving you that feedback. Um, so I think also when people give you feedback, they might be a little bit hesitant. So make sure again that you're saying thank you. One of my favorite things to do is when someone gives me like one nugget of feedback, I'll just say like, and what else? And then I'll pause for a while and give them time to think about it, make the pause a little bit uncomfortable so they keep thinking about it and hopefully will think of something else to give me. But it also shows that like, wow, you really appreciate what they told you and you're eager to learn more. And so it kind of opens them up to feeling like, wow, I can really provide her with feedback. But if you push back or argue with the feedback, they're probably never going to provide you with feedback again, like I think we've talked about previously. So again, just ask for that feedback. I think that's the first step.
Thanks so much, Steph. Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think taking ownership and initiative to try to improve and ask those questions is important. And so right before we wrap up and move on to some questions that we have in the chat, I kind of wanted to end our formal session with just, we're in a scenario, we've given and we've received feedback. Lola, kind of what are the next steps? Where do we go from here? And how do we continue to progress forward?
Yes. So when you've received feedback, let's start with received. When you receive feedback, I think it's important that whether it's good or we've talked a lot about like constructive looking like bad feedback, but I think if good feedback, all feedback is good whenever you actually understand what is the thing that needs to be changed and give me some examples of how it can be changed. That not only helps the person giving feedback make sure that you're asking for things that can actually be changed, right? Or that is justifiable to be changed, right? That helps you gut check, like, am I asking of something that can actually be changed or not? And then, yes, if it can, you should be able to provide some examples of what that looks like so that the person has the ability or the agency to know, okay, let me think of how I best would like to address this feedback. So like, make sure you give examples and you are clear on, are we hitting the same thing? Because if you walk away and don't really know what you should do next, that's a problem too. So ensure you have clarity on what would be good next steps before leaving that conversation, or schedule a time to make sure that you are aware, or that this is my plan to address this. Let me know how you're thinking. I think that's how you can make sure that you're addressing that. And sometimes you might need to step away for a little bit. Like sometimes if the feedback you just received is shocking and you were not prepared, that has happened to me. I'm like, the best thing for me to do is like not be defensive in that moment, right? Like if my natural reaction is to be defensive, I'll try to say, you know what, thank you so much. I want to really think about this. Like I really want to get out of here, but I really want to think about this, and like, can we schedule a time to follow up? And usually that time away helps me not attach to feeling triggered or to feeling like I need to attack, because I'll be ready to go sometime. But like it helps me just take a pause. Again, to Steph's point, like, what are the nuggets, Lauren? What are the nuggets that they're trying to tell me in that? And now let's come back to this conversation when I've cooled off too. So those are a couple of things to think about after receiving feedback or giving it.
Thank you so much. Well, all righty. So I just want to thank all of our speakers today for your insightful perspective. It's advice we can all use, whether you're a student, a new practitioner, or a seasoned pharmacist. As we mentioned, you will be doing feedback probably for the rest of your career. So thank you again to the Women in Pharmacy Committee for planning today's event, and our sponsor, Merck. APHA Foundation is committed to supporting pharmacists in all career stages to become leaders and serve patients in their communities. And tonight you have an opportunity to help continue this work. We hope you'll consider making a personal donation that promote and inspire women pharmacists. To do so, simply visit the link that will be placed in the chat. Now we'll take some additional questions from the audience. Feel free to continue to type questions into the chat or raise your hand and we'll unmute the line if you would like to ask your question verbally. Right now, I'm going to look at the chat and see some of the questions that we have and try to address some of the ones that have the most likes. Again, go ahead and like the question if you're really interested in getting to know the answer. So the first one I see, we touched on this a little bit, but how do we approach a situation where a higher up or a boss isn't giving the feedback that you're actually looking for or that you actually need?
I can address that one. I think I hit on this pretty generally, but more specifically, I would let the boss know what feedback you're looking for. Something that I've done before too is I've shared that in the past I've received this specific example of really helpful feedback from you, and I was able to change my practice, and now it's so much better because of that feedback, and kind of help them understand why you're looking for it. And again, be really specific in the things that you're asking for feedback about. So it can really help them know what information specifically you want and how to best support you.
So one additional tip I will offer, because we have had residents where they said they weren't getting feedback, but preceptors felt they were providing feedback. You may need to have a clarifying expectations conversation on what you see as feedback and what they see as feedback. So just in case there's that one miss, it might be worth having that clarifying conversation.
All right. The next question we have that it looks like a lot of people have is from our students, and I think this can also pertain to new practitioners, especially if you're going through some type of residency or fellowship training. If you have some feedback that might not be the most positive for a professor or your boss or your residency program director, do you feel it's best to approach that as an individual or to approach that as a group if a lot of people have the same feelings or same opinion that they want to address? And how would you deliver that in an appropriate manner to a higher up again?
That's a good question. Man, students, you better come with those questions. Okay. So your first question around like, is it better for a group or individually? I always feel feedback is best individually. Um, it helps no one wants to feel like 1,000 people hate them, or 1,000 people express the same views. I think knowing how something has impacted one person is enough. I think that's enough. And unless you're trying to get a rise out of someone, because I think sometimes that's what we do want. We want people to get a rise, or is the goal to get someone fired? Then yes, numbers will do that, right? But if your goal is to truly have this person accept this feedback and change behavior, the best way to do that is one-on-one. And as a student, I can understand how that is very intimidating, right? Like so intimidating. And you don't know if that, not all bosses, not all professors will be self-aware enough to be ready to receive feedback from a student. Some do believe like, who are you as a student to tell me that, right? And so I think maybe it's tapping into the curiosity to first assess, like, is this professor someone who would be even willing to receive my feedback or willing to receive feedback? And how would that work? Maybe don't make it the first time that you're interacting with this professor to talk about the things you've noticed that you dislike, right? Like, is there other ways that you can kind of get to know that professor or boss in a one-on-one setting where you can now give the feedback in a way that's contextualized, because you kind of know how this person operates, you know what would drive them to want to change. You might see things that you wouldn't have seen if you're just going into this conversation like, I need this thing addressed. So that's what I would say. I know there are some things that require urgency, like if you have very valid concerns of like, if this doesn't get fixed immediately, it's a problem. I would say take it up to someone, not the person who needs the feedback, but someone higher above that person who would coach you on the best way to address that. Because if it's urgent, you don't have time to build that relationship and things like that. So have someone who can address that urgently. But if it's something that you think, if given the time and space, this person could help change their attitude and behavior and make class more welcoming or whatever it may be, then I would encourage you to build those relationships with those, your boss or the professor, to see how you can give that feedback in a way that would actually enact change.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. I think if its situation and severity obviously plays into what the feedback is about. But if you can start with questions, start there with genuine curiosity. And then you can totally use that situation, behavior, impact context. This is a situation, this is what you said in class, and this was the impact on one of my colleagues who was offended by the thing that you said, or whatever it might be. Yeah, and if you can put it in a way that, again, is a mutual win, like I see that you desire to be an impactful leader or professor, and this is how I know this is not what you intended. And so that is my intent in providing you the situation, your choice, and the impact of your choice. It doesn't align with what I know about you. So I wanted to empower you with that information, and then you leave it. Their response, I want to say this before we get done with this, a person's response does not always determine the quality of the job you did in giving the feedback. Their response is their business, right? So only part of that is your responsibility to hold in providing the feedback.
Thank you for your answers and how to approach that difficult situation. And so we'll end with one more question, and anybody can take this question as well. Do you think overall feedback in general has a bad rap or a negative connotation? And then if anybody has an example of a time that you received feedback or you gave feedback and it was a positive experience or a celebratory experience, are you able to share that?
Yes, it has a bad rap. Let's just put that out there. It does. And I think because that's when we only think about being constructive, when we're giving bad feedback. And a lot of us don't know how to give constructive good feedback. Our good feedback is love it. That's great. I mean, I have my team members hold me, they're like, that's not feedback, Lola, and that's when we start tying ourselves to the behavior, to the thing, because you're saying you love this, it's great, but we're not saying why. So number one thing that has been helpful for me is when someone said, hey, that presentation you gave was great. And let me tell you specifically what hit home for me. The way you started with a story helped me connect. And then I was ready to receive the content you gave. That's specific. I can do something with that. It's not about me anymore. I'm not tying how good the presentation to who I am as a person. Now I know specifically it's how I delivered this, right? And so I would say, and yes, celebrate. I always say, food is a good way to celebrate everything. And so, yes, I do try to also celebrate those times when I do see people flourishing in areas we've been working on.
I totally agree that it has a negative connotation, and I think it's hard always to approach the situation. But I've definitely, in my practice, I'm always searching for ways to get better and to grow. I'm like you, Lauren. I'm very much I'm very loud and I'm very outspoken, and so sometimes I have to rein that in a little bit just to get my points across in a valid manner. So thank you so much for answering all of these questions, and so I'll turn it over to Sarah to end for tonight.
Thank you so much, Kelsey, and thank you for being such an amazing moderator tonight on this topic. And thank you to our panelists, Lola, Lauren, and Steph. You guys hit it out of the park. Please stay connected with them. Their contact information will be dropped in the chat by Emily. So you all have noticed that this event has been recorded, and you'll be able to view these insights again shortly. They'll be posted on the APHA Foundation Women in Pharmacy website. In the spirit of feedback, we will also share a short survey with you all, and your feedback helps us to continue to deliver the programming that's aligned with your needs. So we welcome that feedback to us in the survey that you will receive. The APHA Foundation and the Women in Pharmacy Committee will be planning more activities, and we invite you to join us again. Our next event will be held in person at APHA 2025 in Nashville, and tickets will be available when the conference registration opens. And if you want to get involved with the Women in Pharmacy Committee or the Foundation, please visit the Women in Pharmacy webpage on the APHA Foundation website or email Emily Albers. I hope you will join me in supporting the work of the APHA Foundation by making a contribution to support our work. And once again, I want to thank Merck for their support of the Women in Pharmacy events. And thank you all for being here with us. We look forward to seeing you in Nashville in March. And I wish you all a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you all again for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Happy Pharmacy Month.